Um, and yeah, so the book is written specifically, like that's my heart, is for women who have been abused. Also women who grew up just thinking that they're less for the fact that they're women alone. But I do, like Jared was saying, like men will relate to it too, like because the harm is to you too, right? The harm of like being afraid of your own sexuality, like that affect purity culture in that aspect affected men and women. Not knowing that you're allowed to like ask questions, certain things that Christianity in general, thinking you're bad by birth, by just being human, like that affects all of us.
What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I'm Jordan, joined with Jared again, back, and we have a special guest today. Jo is joining us on the podcast. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
So Jo reached out to us because she recently wrote a book and that tells her story coming out of very conservative Christianity and kind of the trauma that inflicted. So Jo, why don't you briefly describe who you are and what your book is about?
Yeah, so I'm Jo Lloyd Johnson. I'm creative, kind, social, empath. I'm an Enneagram 2, so like I'm just a beating heart for the world. I'm a mom, which fits that, right? I'm a mom. I'm an author, a birth doula, and a friend to pretty much everyone I meet. And some of my background, I was born into a 1970s commune. Now, obviously, I'm not old enough to like that's when it started, was in the 70s when communes were showing up everywhere. Um, and the commune was part of the shepherding or discipleship movement. Um, and so that's kind of my roots. Discipling, shepherding movement is part of kind of Assemblies of God, a little charismatic. People rarely fall down, but you know that could happen.
Rarely,
Plenty of
never.
Speaking in tongues, yeah.
Speaking in tongues, yep,
Cool.
exactly. Cool. Prophetic words. Um, God speaks directly to you, type of thing. Grew up my whole life in church every Sunday, Bible study throughout the week. When I was of age, went to youth group. Ended up being the person like starting Christian campuses on my club, gonna save my school for Jesus. And then met my husband while doing a church internship program. Other churches call it like a school of ministry. And we met when we started dating. Our big thing was like, he's called to be a pastor and I'm called to be a pastor's wife. And here we go.
Funny how that works out.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you're looking for if you're in that world. And so that was like our courtship was, him sharing what God's speaking to him about us and our call together. And we hit some hiccups and some bumps along the way. We ended up being offered a church. He was offered a church pastorate when we were 30. And ironically, that was like as the cards of the house started to fall. It was like during the time where we're like finally offered this thing that we had worked our entire lives to gain. We were like, don't know if I want it now. So I'm only 36. My deconstruction is very recent. But yeah, that's me today.
So just wanted to go ahead and share the title of the book just so we get the
that's a good point. Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah. So the book is called Silenced in Eden. So my grandparents believed that we were called so my grandparents were the ones who started the commune. Should explain that. And they were creating the closest thing to Eden on earth, right? Trying to redeem man, because the garden was when we had perfect communion with God. And so they were trying to go back to that place where we're having communion with God every day. And so they created their little 5 acres where God was supposed to come all the time. And it was there in their idea of Eden where I was sexually abused. Trigger warning for whoever's watching, we'll probably be talking about childhood sexual abuse and sexuality and Christianity's negative effects on specifically a woman's sexuality, but in my opinion, all sexuality. Um, and so, in their idea of a Garden of Eden, I was sexually abused, and then that those topics aren't talked about. So it was very much purposely silenced. So the title, Silenced in Eden.
And I noticed throughout the book there's a theme of silence, not just in Eden, but even through like later on in your life too, like once you had left the commune as well. So the title is definitely fitting for the book for sure.
Yeah, I mean, Eden can also just symbolize
Yeah.
Christianity in general, right? Any
Right.
kind of relationship with God. But yes.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you meeting with us, to share your story and to, promote your book. I highly encourage anybody who's listening to go out and get a copy and read it. Um,
I think it sounds like a story, though it's personal, is also not individual. This is a common experience you hear for people, particularly women who come out of very conservative circles. It's interesting that the oppressed sexuality doesn't lead to pure behavior, interestingly enough,
Yeah, right. Like shame and secrecy doesn't actually breed health. Who would have
Yeah.
thought?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No one could have predicted this.
Well,
Right.
in the forward of the book, the person you had write the forward talked about how the book helped them deal with their own stuff. And as I was reading, your stories are just small, like little stories. Each one it kind of feels like it's building the whole time. Like everything just keeps piling up. So as I kept reading, I felt like this weight was just like pressing on me because everything was stacking up. But it also made me realize about my story. And, I grew up in a very conservative Christian home, not as conservative as a commune, but still, like I kept going back to things and they were just small things too. Like, a simple thing of like being in my grandfather's study. He was a Baptist preacher and, little moments I would have with him. So I really appreciate that you were able to connect with the reader and share those, really intimate moments that sometimes they just pass us by. And I don't know if that was conscious when you were writing the book or how did you go about, choosing what you wanted to share?
So, writing the book, like when I started writing, it wasn't exactly like, who am I going to touch? Right. It was, I need to sit with these memories and figure out like how they fucked me up. um, and so it was very much like a therapeutic process at the beginning. I was writing while deconstructing, and like I would sit with, the idea. I in the book I talk about heaven and hell, and the concept of hell, and my fear of anyone I knew that wasn't the proper type of Christian, because like it wasn't in my world. It was like a Christian, but you have to be like the right kind of Christian. um,
Right.
and so it would like I remember staying, especially in high school, like being up late crying for friends because I was since again my bleeding heart like love the world. So someone like me, the concept of a literal hell, I say like a literal hell was hell for me because I was so afraid of my friends actually having eternal pain. Um, and so, like, when I started being like, do I believe that there is a hell? And if I don't believe there's a hell now, and I can like let go of that concept of hell, like, what would it have been like for 16-year-old me to not have had that weight of hell? And how did that mess me up to have this idea that all my friends were going, like, if they weren't the Bible study friends, were gonna be tortured. And it was interesting. It was through writing the book that I started to see like, oh, I started to put those people at arm's length because I couldn't have them in my heart as closely. Um, so I had to like alienate my relationship with them. And so it was writing the book was very much me processing like my own shit. and being like, oh, this makes sense why I acted this way back when. And this was that moment where like how it affected me. Um, so the first version of the book was very much like a concept and all these like threads.
Hmm.
Um, and I shared some of the book with my sister, who is an English teacher. Um, and she was like, Joanna, this is really good. And I think other people would um, not just enjoy reading it, but like that this would speak to people and help them figure out their threads of stuff. And she's the most well read person I know personally. So I'm like, well, if she thinks I'm a decent writer, like maybe I'm a good writer.
Yeah.
um,
Well, I
so
concur.
then
So.
Oh, well, thank you, Jared. I appreciate that. It's still something that if you have read part of the book, like it's something that's hard for me because I grew up not educated very well, especially at the beginning. So it's hard for me to believe like, hey, I can be good at something, especially literacy. Um, but anyways, so it came out as a journal. And then it led to a very long, hard year and a half of like making it into a book. Um, and the woman who wrote the forward was the reason I published because I shared with her the like very messy version that I had. And if you read the forward, she had kind of light bulb moments of like, oh, I was also sexually abused. And um, this book, I mean, she told me at one point, like, this book saved my life. Because when she first had her flashbacks, which I talk about in my book, when I get flashbacks and how just intense that episode of PTSD can be, um, she like had my book. And that was what she held on to while she was in that really dark season. Um, so for me to be like, oh, hey, I helped one person, and this book is not yet like done well. So if I polish it up, maybe I'll help more people. So that was the like, all right, put yourself out there and do it, um, which was really scary. But
Yeah, I
I,
mean, it's a very personal story to put out there, so I can imagine that would be difficult to tell, and I can also see, like, how that would be very helpful. Came from an abusive household, physical abuse, and talking to other people, both who shared that experience, but also who didn't. So, like, sometimes it's like, "What? You mean you can sleep when the door's not locked and you're not in, like, a secured area? What is w Oh, so that's a weird thing for me,
Mm.
okay."
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you're saying, the ones that say like, "Oh yeah, no, dude, I totally lock the door," or "I totally leave a light on," or whatever coping way that they've survived. To hear them, you're like, "Oh, I'm not crazy."
Yeah.
Um, so I'm part of a Louder Than Silence group. A dollar from every book sale actually goes to help. They pay for EMDR therapy, but they also for women who have been sexually abused. Um, but they also do like a 12-week group. So you get together once a week for 12 weeks with only women who have also experienced a level of sexual abuse. And it was so amazing being in a group where they get stuff like that. They're like, oh, well, I have this really dysfunctional whatever. And everyone in that group are like, oh, yeah, me too. Like, so to just understand, like, oh, okay, this is a normal repercussion of what we went through. You don't feel so crazy, which is nice.
I was going to ask. So, before I do that though, was this your first project, like writing, professional writing, or had you done anything prior to this?
Yeah, this is my first puppy.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the things, so you had talked about heaven, and I don't want to give away anything in the book, but there's a moment in the latter part of the book where you kind of have this realization. Is that when you were in Hawaii, where you have this part, and you're like, is that moment where you started to look back and said, what would it have been like had I had this view of hell and heaven? Um,
So in that moment in Hawaii was when my husband, it was around the same season when my husband was offered the pastorate. So it was kind of like the earth was starting to shake under us a little bit. Um, And it was when he's offered that. It's kind of hard to remember specifically because we were leading that Bible study where that happened at the same time. So I'm like
Mhm.
not sure which came exactly first, but
Yeah.
I know it was the same time where we started to question very big, basic theology things. And it wasn't that moment was when I was like, I think I'm going to let go of the concept of hell. But it wasn't until I sat down uh, year and a half, 2 years later, and started writing, where I was like, how did that concept that I am now okay with not holding, how did that affect me growing up?
Mm.
Yeah.
I know that f- the concept of hell is damaging to a lot of people, and like you said, it doesn't seem to make much sense. Like you were going through all of this turmoil and anguish now, imagining your loved ones dead and burning and being tortured. But heaven is supposed to be a place of joy and happiness. How could, for instance, my grandmother was a very devout person. So if she's right, she's in heaven. And I, if she's right, am going to hell. How could she possibly be happy in heaven knowing that her grandson is burning in hell? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. Well,
Um,
there's a part in the book where I um am smitten with a guy who's like it was clear to me he was going to church because he liked me, right? So I'm like, he's not really a Christian, like, um, and I laugh about it now because I'm like, here I am. Didn't matter. Um, but I remember like that was the thing is I was in my mind, I was like, I cannot fall in love with him because I heaven wouldn't be heaven if I fell in love with him.
right.
Mm.
And so again, it was that I have to not love these people, which is like Christianity is all about loving your neighbor, but then you can't love them because if you love them truly, then if they don't go to heaven, you're not in heaven. So it is this really weird, like how does
Yeah.
that work?
Yeah, that's an interesting insight that the one of the central themes of Jesus' ministry is love, and yet a lot of the theology, particularly in conservative circles, almost almost works very hard to be counter to that.
Yeah, if you think about it, there's also this like we don't some churches won't deal with today because they're focused on eternity. And I remember having like a conversation with my dad about like I was helping a girlfriend watching her son and he was like, it doesn't matter if you don't save her soul. And I'm like, to the baby who is getting a good night's sleep and who I'm like, I think it matters. I think it does matter to the mom who is really young and gets a break and probably needs it for her mental health. I think it matters. But in his mind, it didn't matter unless I saved both of their eternal souls. And so I do feel like there's this like not showing up in the moment to show up for this kind of abstract idea of helping someone versus like
Mhm.
help them.
Actually helping them, like right
No.
now. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a good segue, I think, being focusing on on this nebulous future rather than the moment, and that letting the present suffer because of that, which I think leads to a lot of these very damaging behaviors. If you want to take us back to growing up in the commune and the traumatic experiences, but mainly like I'm thinking, how did that environment contribute? Like, what were the things that laid the groundwork to both cause that behavior, but also then excuse it and perpetuate it.
Yeah. So the commune, like I said, was started in the 70s. It was like 73, 75. My uh, it started as my grandparents taking in like kids who had crappy family lives. Um, so it seemed like it started from a very pure, like, let's help in the present moment.
Hmm.
Uh, and 70s, there's drug issues going on. So it's kind of snowballed into they would just let people come and stay as long as they were trying to get their lives together. But then the leaders started to get married and have children. So you have families with young children and people coming off of drugs or homeless people trying to figure out their lives, all living on one plot of land, uh, with this concept that like we're all seeking God, so we're all good people. Um, and I think, and I put this in the back of the book, like it's tribalism. You're like, oh,
Mhm.
we're all the same tribe, so we're hard. Like there's again, we're in the garden, we're safe here, we're all safe here. Um, and so the kids would very much be watched like communally, like they're all outside playing together. They're in the commune, they're safe. Um, and so before it happened to me, it happened to the boy who did it to me. Um, and it's one of those weird things where you're like, I'm just a girl trying to share my story, but I'm also, in order to do so and to understand like the history of it, I had to like interview people and ask questions and like this doesn't make sense. So I have a hunch something happened here. So what I do know is that there was at least two boys who were abused by an adult male uh, in the commune, and then one of those boys started acting out on girls his age and younger. Um, and the kids were just not watched. They were they had a school that was ran like, so everybody's living on the same area, right? And there's a church building that is also a school Monday through Friday, and some kids would come in that weren't living on the property. Um, but during after school, before the dinner bell, everyone just plays outside, uh, and the kids who like are crawling and very little are in the house with a mom watching them, but everybody else is it's a free fall. And I mean, as a kid, like it's kind of fun. You can do whatever you want. Um, but multiple kids like rode their bike down the hill and ran into things. And I remember um, breaking a finger trying to open up a macadamia nut. Like we were just, what's that book where they're just like it's
Free
just
range
chaos.
children.
Yeah. That was us. Um, and so the he starts abusing young kids. It seems like he had moments where it was somewhat caught, um, but nobody wants to think that a kid would be doing something other than like curiosity with another kid. Um, and when the commune fell apart, when my grandfather actually passed away when I was only 4, and it limped along for like 2 years. But in situations like that, the leaders, the word, God,
Mhm.
they're God essentially. And after he passed, it pretty much just fell apart. It took a while, but um, and so it happened to me at the very end. It actually happened I believe it happened at the commune property. And then also once we started moving off of the place, but we all were still friends. And so it happened after that as well. Um, and I shared with his brother, because again, we're all family. I was like, your brother's doing something weird. And then the word got out. He told his parents, and my parents did call Child Protective Services. Um, and the thing that's so frustrating now is that instead of Child Protective Services being told, like, hey, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, we were all living together. And maybe you should interview all of these kids that were all living together with this person who we know perpetrated more than just this one girl. Instead of that happening, they were like, "Oh yeah, he confessed. It only happened to them. He says nothing happened to any. He never
He
did it to
definitely
anyone
wouldn't lie
else."
about it.
Yeah, he's clearly a somebody you can trust. Um, and before they go to, I don't. Again, I'm an investigator. No one wants to talk about this. So I have the little bit that a few people have been willing to share with me. But I do know that the church elders who were left how again this church has fallen apart. But the church elders that were left met with the boy who's 13, and he confessed to the few he already got caught. Um, and then they had talked to some other people because they had daughters. They knew that there were other victims at that time, and told the victims, "Oh well, he got caught for Joanna, so don't worry about it."
Mm.
And that
Um,
not only makes that kind of downplays the scope of the problem, but it also doesn't give them a avenue to speak about what happened to them. It sounds like they're almost telling them, well, what happened to you isn't important because the behavior's already been dealt with. So, which almost seems like it's putting more emphasis on the the aggressor than the victim, you know?
oh yeah, absolutely. And like you're saying, yeah, it limits the scope for the authorities to know what's really happening. Um, it also steals the voice of the victims who didn't get to be like for me. I was 6 years old. He was 13. Um, I completely blocked the memory. So I had to, at 35, 34, read a piece of paper where someone's asking my 6-year-old self what happened. And it was through reading my own replies that I was like, oh, that one flashback, maybe that's what she's talking about. Um, and so these other victims who were also young, like I don't know if they know their own story, and if
Mhm.
that would have been if they would have been given that same opportunity to
Right.
have their words recorded, maybe they would know more of what the hell they went through. Um, so yeah, it's stealing the voice for the victims. It's not honoring that they were victimized. Uh, So that's really hard for me to not be extremely bitter at people who, I mean, if you're clergy in California, you're required, if you
Mhm.
know, you're a required reporter. So they didn't report when they were required to report. And also the ignorance of they only asked the girls. So I know that there were 8 girls. As I've talked to other people, I know he approached men or boys. He approached boys and made offers to boys. I don't know if there are male victims that he also uh, perpetrated or whatever. And it plays into that um, idea that like sexuality is only this one way,
Mhm.
and he couldn't have possibly tried to victimize his guy friends, even though we know that the person who perpetrated him was male. So it's like
Yeah.
just the ignorance of the church leaders in that moment.
It's
Well,
the ignorance of the church leaders, and their inability to handle the situation, and also unwillingness to go get the experts who could have handled it, but also the ignorance of the children and victims who, had they been given a secular education and been better informed about what is healthy and not healthy touching and these sort of things, then it's possible that that kind of behavior might have been caught earlier and fewer people would have been victimized just from education. Hey, Gamma.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing too with a group like the group that I was a part of, and a lot of Christianity that teaches obedience, trains kids to just obey.
Mhm.
They don't like have that autonomy. They are not taught that autonomy of like, this is my body and I get to decide what happens to it. Um, and so even just that like really basic, not just sexual education, but just like personhood.
Mhm.
When you're in a commune, your personhood's stripped. Like it's all about the church. It's all about what God's doing in the group. You're not very much an individual. So even that, like a kid wouldn't think so much about like themselves as a separate. It's like, well, this I can't say anything because it's not good for the group versus this isn't good for me and I should tell somebody because I should feel safe.
Yeah. Well, thank you for telling your story and sharing with us. When I was reading that section of the book, the one thing that surprised me most, and it has to do with this concept of silence that runs throughout the book, is the fact that nobody even checked on you to ask you how you were doing and how, like, that just blew me away that they were even silent with you. And um, it was that something that you just felt like throughout, like, that kind of environment. It was like, we just don't talk about things. We don't. I don't.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, also it's just it's cultural. I think
Mhm.
that we're a lot more comfortable talking about things nowadays. So a family, our parents' generation weren't as comfortable talking about things just
Right.
in general. Um, but also like the focus of my parents at that time was so, again, like the whole. Um, and when you're in a commune or high control group like this, where your focus is the church, your family structure is off because it's the leader is the head, and you're like running your family, but also like auntie over here is helping and they're helping and you're trusting everybody, and so the like sanctity and safety of family is not there. So mom and dad are mom and dad, but also like auntie over here also will put me to bed and also will spank me and also will um so you don't have that type of bond with your mom and your dad that creates safety for those conversations,
Mm.
right? A conversation like hey, so and so did this and it didn't feel right, but I don't really know why it didn't feel right, but I didn't like it. um that's a vulnerable thing to say
Mhm.
even at 6 years old. Um, and a kid has to feel safe to be vulnerable. So, like, if there's no safety and the parents aren't creating safety because they have this false sense of safety, right? The
Yeah.
commune's safe. So, I don't need to create safety. It just is safe.
There's a couple other things in the book where you talk about being vulnerable and it leads to some other consequences. Like, it's something extremely innocent, with the swing set, for example. And like, so that could even teach you, like, oh, I don't speak about anything because I'm going to get spanked or somebody's going to get spanked. Um, so,
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely in my form, like the form of Christianity, it was the failures are our failures. Um and like we're called to be examples for God, and we're called to be a light to the world, uh and God helps us not sin. So this idea of like, if I mess up, it's on me and I should be ashamed of it, doesn't breed like a, hey, mom, I skinned my knee. Can you help clean me up? Like just the littlest things as a kid, you internalize that, oh, it must be my fault. Um, and then if it's my fault, I mean, I get into this in the book with a situation where my uncle's living with us and he isn't the safest. um, and I made it my fault because I was like, well, I backtalked him and he's my elder. Uh, so yeah, it's as the kid, you internalize this, I must have done something wrong or this wouldn't have happened to me.
yeah, that's pretty profound to think about, looking back at it and like how much you just, it's ingrained. It's almost like taught to you to keep yourself quiet or to not bring things up or to take on the fault. The system kind of makes it so.
Yeah, and
Well,
I was just oh, sorry. I was just thinking very recently, looking back at my lack of proper education, um, and how I internalized that as like it was my fault that I wasn't able to read. And I remember needing help for like homework, right? A lot of kids need help, and feeling like a burden. Like I've got to go ask mom for help and she's busy, and she had 4 kids. She was busy and she was working full time and like legit, but it was the reality of like I wasn't okay to have a need that that was just a legitimate need. I didn't feel okay to have those. And because I had those, I felt guilt about having regular ass needs. Um,
Yeah.
and that's something I like struggle with now. Like, I'm like, oh yeah, Joe, you get to have needs. Like, it's okay. You're allowed to ask your husband for like a night off because you need help with something, or you're just very basic things. I still very much struggle with. I'm human and I have needs.
And not having guilt associated with that.
Right.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
in many conservative circles, it's a very guilt-driven system. You're born bad, and you should feel bad about it. Is the idea?
Yeah.
And I
Well,
did. It worked.
yeah.
I
Well, that
definitely felt bad about being human.
that makes me think of something else you talk about in the book, and how um, needing help, you know, sometimes as a Christian in this Christian world, you just want to be able to pray and make it go away. But obviously, you're still working through some of these things, and it takes time and it takes professional help in some instances where we need to seek therapy. Did you want to speak a little bit about that and just that concept of just being able the resistance for Christians to seek outside help? I guess um,
Yeah. Certain things you can't pray away. And trust me, I've tried. um, and that was very much like, so we were taught to pray it away. And excuse me, my dad, uh, injured his back when I was like 2 months old. Still hasn't been healed, and he prays harder than anybody I've ever met. um, and we didn't growing up. We didn't really believe in mental health. God healed. If you're depressed, you need to ask God for joy. If you had, I mean, like schizophrenia was considered something that could be healed.
It's obviously
Everything was
demon
something,
possession.
yeah. Mm. And for my husband, that the ignorance around mental health was the like last straw for him. For me, it was definitely headship and patriarchy and having 3 daughters and being like, oh no, this fucked me enough. I'm not gonna let it mess with them. Um, but for my husband who has anxiety and who's like every member of his family has a level of anxiety or ADD or whatever, things that could need some professional guidance. Um, and he has memories of people coming and praying demons out of his mom when it was like, no, they just messed up her medication and she needs to get back on it. Like,
Yeah, there can definitely be this idea that if you're not being healed, it's again, it's your fault because you don't have enough faith, you're not praying hard enough, and also that if you seek outside help, it's like you're not trusting God, you know?
yeah,
So like if God wanted you to be healed, he'd heal you, That sort of
right,
idea.
right. And that there's a purpose for your pain or lack of healing. Like, oh, well, God wants to use it for something before he can heal you. Uh, yeah. I
Which
definitely I was just gonna say, like, I definitely don't believe that anymore. And in the book, I talk about when I get flashbacks and being like, I think I want to see a therapist, but I don't know if my parents would be okay with me seeing a therapist. And then them kind of downgrade, like downplaying what happened and being like, well, I should just be fine then. Like I shouldn't
yeah.
need anybody's else anybody's help. And I internalized it so much that I told myself I was fine.
mm,
And trust me, here years later, like, no, I was not fine. My brain did what it had to do to survive being 16, having flashbacks and being like, oh, you have nothing else to do but to like push this down deeper and not address it. And so that's what it did.
the whole structure, you mentioned the patriarchy and the harm that it did to you. Um, Something that has struck me in the past few years is that it harms everyone involved, not just I mean, it clearly harms women by subjugating them, by silencing them, and by encouraging harm on them. But it somehow manages to not even benefit the group it's supposed to be benefiting, because they also can't ask for help. When you're in a situation like that, you're supposed to be the one that's in charge. So if anything goes wrong, it's your fault. And that's, all there is to it. Even more guilt is laid on
Yeah.
top of it. So does that reflect kind of the experience your husband had? And I was wondering, how have you navigated that when you're deconstructing, trying to like grow from these patriarchal roots?
Yeah. Um, it's not easy. Especially like what I had a podcast air this week or something, and my husband like is the first one to want to jump on and listen. Um, and he literally like an hour or two before jumping on here, he asked me to do something in the kitchen. I was in a shit mood, and I was like, "Hey, you like just back off. You can do that too." And he was like, "Oh, I'm not this patriarchal, whatever." And I was like, "Hey, well, I was just pointing out that I have my hands full, and you're right there." Um, it's one of those things where I even told him, I was like, "You realize when I talk about patriarchy and men who hold their authority as a way of like purposely pushing a woman down." I was like, "I'm not talking about you." Like, and he's like, "Well, I was in that." I'm like, "You were raised in that. You were never that." Um, and it's kind of this weird thing because me and him were friends. First of all, we were like buddies before we ever dated. And so he saw me as a friend and a peer before he saw me as like his future wife, which I think definitely played into just our dynamic. We were already friends. We already were working in like we were running a youth Bible study together already. So I never came in as like the arm candy or the cute girl, whatever. I was like his buddy, and then he was like, "Oh, and you're cute. Hold on." um, so we
Sometimes it takes
didn't.
us longer to realize these things,
Yeah, yeah. Well, he was younger, so I was like, whatever. And then he finally grew up, and I was like, oh, okay. Um, but it's been interesting because I have to remind him, like, hey, you do help out. Like, hey, you have stepped up. Um, yeah. So that dynamic is still something that I feel like we're bumping up against a bit right now. Just as I start to like name it, and he has to like realize, oh, this isn't me. This is like the system we lived under that we both have come out of. So she's not throwing me out with the bathwater. Like she's not saying that I'm part of the issue. Um, but there was definitely like the very beginning of our marriage, the only relationships we were shown were the woman stays home with the kids and the husband's supposed to make more money, and the woman does the dishes and does the baking and the cooking and the whatever. um, and so we had moments where we kind of fall into that. After we had our first daughter, I knew I wanted to stay home. So I was like, all right, I'll jump into that role. That's totally fine. Um, and it was at like our third kid where my husband was like, oh, if I don't start like helping, like she's gonna break.
yeah.
Like, and I love her and I don't want her to have a mental breakdown and then be stuck with the kids and her in like a hospital. Um, so we've had more years of a healthy shared uh, workload than we've had outside of Christianity, which I think, I think that's kind of like it was our slippery slope, right? Once he was like, "Hey, I want her to feel equal," and then it's like, "Oh, well, that doesn't really fit with the system that tells me she's not equal."
Right.
Um,
Well,
yeah.
sometimes they'll pull the separate but equal line, like, "Oh,
Oh,
men and women are equal. They're just, not allowed to teach and stuff," because they wouldn't want to worry their pretty little heads over that.
yeah, that line hit me so much that it's, I think, a chapter title in the book. um, and I point out like separate but equals never, like if history has
No,
taught
not
us
equal. Yeah.
anything, that's never actually equal. Like that's a clearly bullshit lie, right? Um, And I share a story about when I was an intern, I was helping with the children's ministry, and me and the female part of that ministry, because it was like I was thinking churches have like two ways, okay, that they deal with women in ministry. They either say women like can't teach at all, and they can't preach, they can't teach unless they're just doing kids. Or they say, oh, a woman can, but only if she does it with her husband. So you have like the pastor and the pastor's wife, or the pastor and pastor, but we all know that like the male's the real head of it,
Mhm.
right? And she has to be like submitted to him. So when I was like 16, I was going to one of those churches where like a female could be titled pastor, but it was always like they are the pastors, the male and the female husband and wife were pastor. But she had to be submitted to him, right? So, anyways, in that kind of a church, I was the assistant of the children's pastor, but it was the female, and we would come up with the what he's going to share on like the whole sermon, the kids program, the like fun puppets or whatever. We came up with it all, and then on Sunday, her husband would show up. I would hand him the script that we worked all week on. He would grab the microphone and read from it, and they together were the ministry. I remember being like, at the time, I didn't even think about like, hey, us two girls literally do all the work. He's the one up in front with a mic, and they together are the ones that are coined the leaders. And that's separate but equal.
Yeah.
One is doing all
Which
of the work, and the other one is standing there smiling, saying, thanks for the work you did. And now I will present this in front of everyone like I did part of it.
which contributes to like you've got the attitude of silence when it comes to negative things, not wanting to bring them up, but also silencing their victories because you can't have a victory that's yours. It's at best yours and God's, but probably
Well,
yours and your husband's.
I was going to say, well, as a woman, it's not yours and God's. It's yours and your husband's and God's.
That's right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. So you mentioned that you've been your deconstruction is relatively recent, and you've kind of alluded to it a couple times. What was the watershed moment for you, where as an adult, you and your husband? I know you mentioned it was like when you were getting this pastorship. How did that look, having spent your entire life steeped in this worldview, and then you realize this isn't for me? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm actually writing a second, possibly like a second, third book, and the second one is going to be more specific to like this, um, because when my husband and I had some bumps in the road and kind of were not in ministry for a while, and I was the one like, we're gonna do this. This is still gonna happen. I'm believing. I'm praying while he's not working for it, and I'm gonna, when striving and still hoping. Um, and then we end up in Hawaii, and we're going to Calvary Chapel. Calvary Chapel is part of the one where a woman cannot have a title as pastor. It's not her and him; it's him, all him, full stop. And my husband was preaching at the Calvary Chapel we went to. There's a nearby Calvary Chapel that the pastor had a sex scandal and ran off island. And so they have no pastor. So they asked my husband to share a couple times on Sunday. And then they took us to dinner and like, hey, what do you think about like being pastor? Um, and my husband and I have a conversation after, and I was like, so Calvary Chapel, would I even be able to like share my testimony? Like get up and do like a before, like, hey, God's sharing this one thing with me. Like not do a whole sermon. I just would like, what if I have a word to share? Could I get on stage? And again, I did it church school of ministry. I have been leading Bible studies years at that time. His last like two sermons, I would be like, hey, look up the Greek in this word. And like, like I'm literally helping him excited about, what God is doing for us. um, and he looks at me, he's like, I don't, I don't think you would be able to even get on like behind the pulpit. I don't think that they would be okay with that. And so in that was my moment of, okay, wait. You're telling me that in the 5 years where you were struggling and drinking and I was the like going after God, we're going to get this still. That even though I did that, now you're going to be the one with the title pastor, with the only one who can speak. So if I have any word, I have to have you share it. And he was like, how do you feel about that? Like, are you okay with that? And I was like, in my head screaming, fuck no. and and having my, again, I spent my whole life silent, sitting there going, am I okay with that? Like, can I do that longer of being quiet? Can I continue to just spend my whole life silent behind you, sitting in the front row, keeping your kids quiet and letting you be the, one man show? Um, and just like how unfair that was. Like that for me was that breaking point of like, what the hell? This doesn't make any sense. And there was a lot of other things with the church too. Like for me, when I look back, even now, when I look back at my years with Christianity, it's the relationships. It's that youth group where you like have your buddies showing up and you play games and you feel like someone's in your corner and someone's there for you. In that church, it was so surface that like nobody hung out. Nobody went to lunch afterwards. Nobody got there and talked over coffee early. Like there was no relationship. And just seeing how church can be so surface, people just dress up, show up and do their like, okay, sit in the pew for this long, sing this many hymns, and go home. I was like, I don't want anything to do with this. This doesn't seem like community at all. And if community is the one thing that like I want, maybe I should not be looking inside of a church.
You should be looking at a commune.
I hear they're great.
Yeah, they're great. Yeah, totally fine. Sleep and all that.
I was gonna. So as you're deconstructing throughout the book, you quote quite a few scripture verses, and some points it seems like you're kind of pointing out some of the hypocrisy in there, but there also seems to be a reverence for it too. Are you still struggling with that at all, and like finding out where you fit in that picture and how you view like the Christian text or the Christian worldview coming from it?
So like the book was written in the state I was in while writing it, right? Like I said, it took like a year and a half of editing or a couple months from that. So for the last like 2 years, I've been still steadily on my own journey. And when I published the book, I don't think I was really ready to like fully let go of. I mean, Christianity was my label for 30 plus years. It is the culture that we all have come from in reality, all of us. If you grew up in it or not, like it has affected our culture. And so at the time, I think I still had some fondness for it. I definitely have hit at times a like burn the motherfucker down place. And I think that's something that I'm still like, I feel like it ebbs and flows. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Science Mike, Mike McGar. He's a Christian turned atheist turned progressive Christian. But he likes to say like, I'm an atheist some days and I'm a Christian some days. I won't call myself a Christian ever, but I do feel like I have like burned the church to the ground days and like, if it works for you, good for you days. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment.
It's funny. We had a friend of mine, Art, on here who's a very progressive pastor, and we asked him a similar question. He was like, "Yeah, I'm like 30% atheist."
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too because growing up atheists, my parents would talk about atheists as these like they only believe in science and they hate Christians and they don't believe in any kind of spirituality. They don't believe in any kind of other. They're materialistic, blah blah blah. And like on this side, I'm like talking to atheists. I'm like, yeah, you guys seem totally cool. I've heard it like atheists that are like almost mystic types, and I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
you guys are like a really wide
We
range.
Oh
come
yeah,
in
You're
all
not
shapes and sizes.
there's
Yeah.
there's some atheists who are total jerks. There's some who are really cool. There are some that are very materialist. There's some that are, you know, very
well.
spiritual. So
Right, exactly. That realm was what was so like mind blowing to me because when I first like deconverted, I wasn't sure what the hell to call myself. And then I met some atheists and I'm like, "Oh yeah, no, we're okay." Cuz I'm not really agnostic, like I don't believe in any specific deity like that there is a separate. I definitely am spiritual. Um I've experienced it and the book talks a little bit about it. Like I've experienced things that don't the physical body doesn't explain. And I still have weird shit happen where I'm like, I feel like I need to tell you something, and I'll like share something, and they're like, cry, and I'm like, Christian me would be like, that was a word from God. Me, and now I'm
Yeah.
like, maybe I just sensed that shit on you. I don't know.
uh well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your story. I know a lot of women that I grew up with in the church who have very similar stories but don't feel empowered to share it, often because they're still in families where that wouldn't be allowed, and so they kind of have to struggle on their own by themselves. And so it's super important that uh, people who have experienced that, who have the bravery and also the capacity to, tell them that they're not alone, and that, that this isn't your fault, and it's not, and there's a way out of it. I think that's a really important message for people to hear. And so on that, where can people find this book, and where should they look for you if they want to hear more of your work?
Yeah. So on Instagram, I'm Jo Lloyd Johnson. On Facebook, also Jo Lloyd Johnson. But Instagram is my like. I'll actually check that more often. Um, and the book Silenced in Eden is on Amazon. And also, if anybody who's listening is female and been sexually abused, Louder Than Silence is an amazing organization that has 12-week groups and also helps pay for EMDR therapy. I'm currently doing EMDR on their grant. And like my goal is to at least raise enough money to pay back for what they're paying for me. Um, and they always need money. Like sadly, they just whoever is willing to help support their cause. I know their wait list for EMDR is pretty backed up at this point. Um, but as like a victim, it's costly to get the help. Like if you honor like, hey, I do need therapy, I do need help, and that's okay to need help. Sometimes people don't have the money for it. So this organization is amazing, trying to actually help people get the help that they deserve, that you know is needed, um, and yeah. So the book is written specifically like that's my heart is for women who have been abused, also women who grew up just thinking that they're less for the fact that they're women alone. But I do, like Jared was saying, like men will relate to it too, like because you're the harm is to you too, right? The harm of like being afraid of your own sexuality, like that affect purity culture in that aspect affected men and women. um Not knowing that you're allowed to like ask questions, certain things that Christianity in general, thinking you're bad by birth, by just being human, like that affects all of us. And so anybody can relate to that. And I've had people who were sexually abused and grew up non-Christian completely, and they're like, no, it still really spoke to me. I have a reader right now who grew up um, in uh, a non-Christian like hippie cult. And she was like, this is totally relevant for me too. So, um, yeah, I feel like anybody can get something from it. Um, but yeah, Silenced in Eden on Amazon. Really long-winded. Sorry.
That's fine. We'll put the link to not only the book, but also the charity you mentioned and some other resources in the description. It's a shame we don't live in a modern country where you can just get the help you need if you need it. That would
That
be
would be
nice.
nice.
Yeah. But we won't go into socialized medicine here at the end. But yeah, those links will all be in the description. And if you need help, please do reach out to them. And if you can't find anything, if all else fails, reach out to myself or Jared, I'm sure Joe, and we'll make sure you get the help you need.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So again, thanks a ton for coming on and sharing your story. We really appreciate it. Everyone should go check out that book. It's I actually checked Amazon, and if you have Kindle Unlimited, it's free. You can just read it just right there at Kindle Unlimited.
Boom.
So, yeah, too easy. But do that, and until next time, remember, you've always got reason to doubt.
Peace out.